got someone coming in, I'll wait just a second. So, what is deemed to be a great challenge to God and to His truth, all that He said. The theory of evolution is not just a disagreement about how life has developed and gone on. Those who are at the forefront in leading the thinking about evolution are not only atheists, they are materialists, they are humanists. If you're political, they're largely Marxists, and they see all of this as the logical end and conclusion of the theory of evolution. We have studied thus far in 2 nights and have seen that evolution is not a science. Now I know you may hear preachers say that, and you may think a preacher is shooting from the hip when he does that. I think you can see that I have studied enough that I am qualified to say what I'm saying in the first place. In the second place, every quotation that I have given you has been from an evolutionist. I have not quoted any authority yet that believes in creation. Every aspect of evolution that we've looked at, and we've looked at it as a broad spectrum and will continue to do that, has evolutionists pointing out what is wrong with that particular idea and why it can't be so. And he will have evolutionists looking at his ideas telling him why it cannot be so. And I think they're all right. I don't think any of those things are so. Evolution is not a science, it is a faith. Remember just a brief definition we gave from George Gaylord Simpson, who has been known in most of this century as Mr. Evolution. And certainly while it's not a full definition of science, it gives us something to work on when he says, that which cannot be checked by observation is not science. And those aspects of evolution that we've looked at cannot be checked by observation. Scientists may believe this, and those men may follow scientific pursuits. But when they leave their investigations and they become apostles and evangelists of that which they cannot demonstrate, that which they cannot show, then they leave the realm of scientists and become apologists for humanistic philosophy. The reasons that we have decided that evolution is faith is that they have a faith in a beginning that is unseen, it is undemonstrated, and it is unrepeatable. They have believed in spontaneous generation. At one time there was absolutely no life. And under 2 billion years of just the right circumstances, life came into being. No one saw that. They cannot demonstrate that. If anybody does demonstrate it, they have not demonstrated that life can come from non-life. All they have done is shown that it takes intelligence to produce life. And it's unrepeatable because life is now here. Therefore, evolution has a faith in a beginning that they cannot demonstrate and that cannot be seen by observation. They have a faith in the multiplied, undiscovered, intermediate life forms. They can find alligators and they can find birds, and they say the closest relative to the birds are the alligators, but they can't find all the millions of steps in slow evolution that must have existed between the alligators and the birds. And that's just given as an example. Of all the life forms, not only the groupings that we have here on the board, but of all of the life forms, there is absolutely no fossil evidence of those forms of life ever existing. We don't find them alive in nature now. There are gaps between every life form that we know about. Vast gaps. And yet the evolutionist believes that there are forms of life that have filled in all of those gaps. Innumerable forms of life. Why is it that we can find each form of life but we can't find all of those innumerable forms that fill in the gaps? They're not there. And so the evolutionist has a faith. He has faith that all of those life forms did exist in those gaps, even though we have no record of them. And then, of course, there are, or is, a new breed of scientists now who is throwing out all that they've understood about the theory of evolution before. They thrown out Lyell's principles a long time ago. They threw out Darwin's principles, and they came up with something they call neo-Darwinism. And in all of this, they were looking for a mechanism by which evolution could work, a mechanism that could cause an alligator to make all of the changes needed to turn into a bird. And now these new scientists say we don't know how it happened. We believe evolution happened, but we believe that we're through with Darwin and that none of Darwin's ideas are correct. And we don't believe in neo-Darwinism either. As Murray Eden put it, we need new, undiscovered natural laws, physical, chemical, and biological. They have faith that those laws exist, but they have not found those laws yet by which one life form can turn into another life form. Evolution is a faith, not a science. And as one of the most eminent of the French scientists said, Pierre P. Grasset, when it comes to determining that now, how the different life forms can be gapped and tied together, and indeed how they began, his word for biology is that it is impotent. He expects it to remain so, and that we may simply have to leave it to the realm of metaphysics, that which is unnatural or supernatural. And I believe he's right about that. We'll have to leave it up to God, and God has told us about how life began and how life has functioned since it did begin. So, for all of those reasons, we say, and I think justly so, that while scientists, not all scientists, but while the majority of scientists believe in evolution, and they may follow and pursue scientific investigations, I would not argue with them being scientists and all of that, but when they become, as we said a moment ago, apostles of and evangelists for the theory of evolution, they're not acting in science as scientists in doing that. We're not opposed to science. If there's anybody that ought to appreciate science, it is a Christian. In Romans, the first chapter, verse 20, a passage we've noticed each evening, Paul says of God, the invisible things of Him since the creation of the world are clearly seen, being perceived through the things that are made. And what are these invisible things of God that we may see since the creation of the world? His everlasting power and divinity. We can see that there is something higher than man. We can see that there is a power that man cannot explain. When we see God's laws and develop them in our study and come to understand them, we just simply see something of the glory of God. The 19th Psalm, verse 1, we read, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth His handiwork. The next verse goes ahead to point out that though there is no language, day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. In the way that things go on, in the laws by which all things operate, we see the knowledge and we see the power and we see the glory of God. It says, Professor Louis Agassiz of Harvard University, the late professor now, I don't know if you can find anybody else at Harvard with this much faith anymore, but as he said a good while ago about science, in our study of natural objects, we are approaching the thoughts of the Creator, reading His conceptions, interpreting a system that is His and not ours. Or Dr. Warren Weaver, formerly chairman of the board of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, he said, every new discovery of science is a further revelation of the order which God has built into His universe. A Christian should not be anti-science, anti-scientific, but let him stand opposed to any idea that is contrary to the Word of God. Let him make sure he understands the Word of God, because the same God who gave us the Word gave us all of the laws that we call the laws of science. Well, modern science, as we have seen, has been trying to find how evolution might have happened. And that's why you young people, you read in your textbooks, many scientists believe thus and so. Jean called last night. She had talked to a young man and said, "Are these things really being taught in school?" And he said, "Yes." "Are they being taught as fact?" And he said, "Well, no, it wasn't stated as fact in the textbook, but when we had to answer on the test, we had to answer as if it is fact." But the point still remains that all of this is an investigation trying to understand how evolution might have occurred, how it might have taken place, what mechanism could have been triggered to cause an alligator to turn into a bird, or an ape to turn into a man, or a fish to turn into a frog. But you know that there is some place we can go where there is a record of what has happened, not what might have happened, but what has happened. And that's to the fossil record. Now, most of you know what fossils are. If you've ever picked up a rock and seen the imprint of a fish shell there, or a bone indeed imprinted in a rock, what you're seeing is a fossil. Something that lived at one time and left a record there, being buried and put under pressure, preserved somehow, so that its mark, at least, is still there. That's a fossil. And we have rocks that are just greatly rich with fossil forms. Some not very large rocks, with billions of fossils. Many rich returns from our investigation of fossils. And so we may leave what we were looking at last evening as to how evolution might take place and look at a record of what has taken place. Now, if you're not very familiar with this area of study, you might suppose that I have lost my senses if I am seriously going to consider the fossil record. That has been one of the most romantic appeals of the evolutionists to the young mind in all the science textbooks, in grammar school, in the high school, and in freshman biology, in college, or paleobiology in college. But believers in the Word of God noticed a long, long time ago that the fossil record does not belong to the evolutionists. The fossil record belongs to the one who believes in God and who believes in creation. And I hope that we can deal with our material effectively enough this evening that you will be able to understand how that's so. It's like the DNA that newspaper reporters say, since all living things have in common, that proves evolution. There's quite an extrapolation there, a word that evolutionists like to use. There's quite a jump in logic there to say that. And don't be afraid of DNA. As we looked at DNA, we saw that DNA is a code and it determines what the next life form is going to be, and it's going to be only what is in the life form that has preceded it. And you're not going to get birds from alligators through DNA, even manipulating it. You might get an alligator without a leg. You might get his tail in the wrong place. You might rearrange his teeth. But operating with DNA, you will never get a bird. And just like the fossil record, DNA belongs to the person who believes in God and who believes in creation. Before getting into looking at the fossil record and what we may find in paleontology and geology, I want to explain to you two terms. One is uniformitarianism, and the other is catastrophism. Until the early part of the last century, all geologists were catastrophists. They explained the Earth's crust and what you saw in the rocks by virtue of the fact that tremendous catastrophes had taken place in the past that have helped shape the Earth's crust in a relatively short period of time. They would not believe, for instance, that it took 17 million years for Grand Canyon to perform, but through perhaps a gigantic earthquake, Grand Canyon could have formed in a relatively short period of time. The uniformitarian says, and this is a statement that came out of Darrell's 5th grade science book, The present is the key to the past. If you want to understand what has taken place in the past, you look at the present. You saw what happened today and how slowly things were changing about you. Their explanation is that things have always changed that slowly. Just what you have seen today. And no great catastrophe has ever occurred to do a great amount of geological work until they get in trouble. And then they want whole mountains moving from Africa over to Switzerland and some other rather exceptional things, forgetting that they are uniformitarianists. So remember that there are those who look at geology from a catastrophic viewpoint, and there are those who look at it from a uniformitarian viewpoint. Now those terms are going to come up in the lesson again. As a Christian, I believe that the catastrophist is right. I believe there was a flood that did a great amount of geological work in a short period of time. I believe in the beginning, when the earth was compacted amidst water and out of water, that in that very act of creation, a tremendous amount of geological work was done in a very short period of time. Which one of these views is going to prevail? Some of you are going to be surprised, I suppose, when we come to our conclusion this evening and listen to some fresh scientists, a whole younger generation of scientists, who are just now making their voices known, but they've just about gotten control of Harvard University, which is going to give them a great deal of influence, and they've just about gotten a hold of the University of California, Berkeley, which is going to give them a great deal of influence. Well, here is a representation of a cover that was on a book in the library for first to third graders. As I went with my youngsters into the library in Zion, Illinois, to help them look up some material on this subject because they were facing it at that particular time. And this is the representation of a mountain. And instead of the words, there were pictures. And the cover was representing what you would find if you started digging in the top of that mountain. You would first of all find man there. And if you dug further, you would find apes there. And if you dug further, you would find mammals and birds. And if you dug further, you would find reptiles. Digging further and deeper, you would come across amphibians. And digging further, you would come across fish, and nothing above fish, just fish. And digging further, you would come across the chordates, and including the great sea worms, shelled or unshelled. And then you would come across the metazoa, the many-celled small forms of life, and the protozoa, finally, the one-celled forms of life. Now I want to say something, and I do not say this carelessly. This is not popping off. And it's absolute fact. And I'll read you several statements to prove it. I don't care where you start digging on this earth. There is nowhere that you can dig, or at least that has been done, where you will find life forms lined up in that order. Now let me say that again. There is nowhere on the surface of this earth where you're going to find things lined up in this order. In the first place, one of the problems is that evolution and the geological record that they would like to find requires a fossil depth of 100 miles to cover 600 million years of evolution. But the deepest that they have ever found a fossil record is 2 to 3 miles. Something must be missing. And in our lesson tonight, we're going to find out what is missing. But I suppose you say, after all, this was meant for first to third graders, and that is oversimplification. Well, I will grant that is oversimplification. But that is essentially what has been done in all of these big words for scientists. They line the earth up into these different ages the Quaternary, that's where we're living now. The Tertiary, here's where mammals got started. The Cretaceous, and here's where dinosaurs became extinct. Jurassic, here's where birds came into the picture. Triassic, that's where the dinosaurs and the other reptiles began. The Permian, the Pennsylvanian, the Mississippian, and here's where your amphibians came in. The Devonian, Silurian, Ordovician, and Cambrian. And you see that in a textbook, and the impression that it is supposed to leave with you is, this proves evolution. But I want to tell you this. Do you know how they got this whole geological column of rocks bearing fossils? They didn't find this anywhere upon the face of the earth. They found certain populations that were predominant in a certain rock, but they have not found rocks and a whole type of rock that they will say contains only one population. They will have to admit that there are exceptions. But how did they get this whole geological column? What they did was take a rock from over here and say, oh, that's got a bird in it, several birds, that's the key fossil there, that goes right here. And then they go and they find early dinosaurs and they say, well, that's the key fossil, that goes right here. And then they find a rock over here with fossils of amphibians in it, oh, that goes right here. And then they find a rock that's got several fish in it. Now there may be some other things there too, but because it's got several fish in it, they put it there. And then they find some mammals, and when they find fossils of mammals, they put it up there. They didn't find them in that order. They put it in that order, and then put it in the textbook as evidence of evolution. That's undeniable. That's exactly what has happened. I want to give you some statements to show that what I'm saying is so. I have said nowhere on all the earth has this order of rocks bearing fossils been found. For instance, this statement from Geology Today. Because the detailed sequence of evolution is not evident in the fossil record, paleobiology relies on modern biological knowledge to work out the likely sequence of evolution. Now, did you hear what that said? Let me emphasize some of that again. Because the detailed sequence of evolution is not in the fossil record. That's from Geology Today, published in 1973. Well, you would think that there's a detailed picture of the evolutionary process by looking at that. But what do they rely on? How did they get it like that? Paleobiology relies on modern biological knowledge or theory to work out the likely sequence of evolution. All that says is what I said. That they believe these animals came into existence in these forms, and so when they find a rock, they put it where they think it ought to go. And then they turn around and they say, this proves evolution. And of course all that is circular reasoning. It goes like this. And this is from Geology Today, also, page 398. The traditional rule, or the traditional role of paleobiology is the important business of establishing the ages of sequences of rocks. Fossils are the most useful for dating. How do they date these things? How do they decide this is 600 million years? Because they think it took us 600 million years to get from the core dates up to where we are at the present time. There's no way they know that rock is 600 million years old. They date it because that's where the fossil it shows should be according to evolution. That's what that statement I just read to you from Geology Today says. And then I want to read to you some other statements along this line about how they arrange this geographical column or geological column. Biological correlations are still the most useful method in our efforts to establish relative contemporaneity of events throughout the geologic past. How do they decide what are contemporaneous? Why, by biological correlations. This obviously came from this, so this rock goes here and this rock goes there. That's how they decide to do that. And how do they know this goes here and that goes there? Because of the theory of evolution. These things have been arranged with the presumption that evolution is so, and then they turn around and say it proves that evolution is so. They are based on the history of life as represented by fossils in the rocks. Based upon life. So their theory of life has helped them to arrange all of this, and I have said, of course, that that is circular reasoning. Here, if I may bend your patience a little bit, I want to read you 2 or 3 paragraphs along this line. First of all, fossils thus make it possible to recognize rocks of the same age in different parts of the earth, and in this way to correlate events and work out history of the earth as a whole. They furnish us with a chronology on which events are arranged like pearls on a string. Here's the string, and these are the pearls, and they are arranged according to the theory of evolution. Geology Today, again quoting from page 400, says, in this, geologists have been accused of using circular reasoning, and in a sense, it is. In a sense, nothing. It is circular reasoning. Here's another statement, and this came from an article on geology in the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1956. It cannot be denied from a strictly philosophical standpoint, geologists are arguing in a circle. The succession of organisms has been determined by a study of their remains embedded in the rocks, and the relative ages of the rocks are determined by the remains of the organisms that they contain. Now here's what that says. There's a little cartoon that's put out by a brother in Christ. His name is Robert West, and the name of the cartoon is Theophilus. And this one cartoon had 3, maybe 4 panels. But in one panel it has the little geologist with his what kind of explorer's hat and his wire-rimmed glasses and his little explorer shorts on. And he's digging in the side of a hill. Eureka, I found it! I found my 500-million-year-old fish! And Theophilus says, how do you know that fish is 500 million years old? He says, because it's in this 500 million-year-old rock. And Theophilus is a little curious, and he says, how do you know that's a 500 million-year-old rock? And he said, why? Because it had this 500 million-year-old fish in it. Now that's exactly what I read to you from these scientists who are evolutionists, and they admit that they are arguing in a circle. And we're going to talk about some other ways of dating in just a moment, though I'm not going to go into great detail within this evening. But you heard me read just a moment ago that the most useful means of dating the rocks are by the fossils that are therein. And they're using what they believe about evolution to decide how old that rock must be, and therefore where to place it in this. I hope I haven't bored you with that. But this is used as a principal influence to influence the minds of youngsters and to get them to see that evolution must be so, and all they're doing is arguing in a circle. And it is a type of argument that should not be accepted by a scientist, to say the least. Well, let's talk about dating for a moment. How about all these millions of years that we find through different methods of dating? Perhaps the most popular and the one you've heard of is carbon-14. And the originator of carbon-14 method of dating said it was reliable only back to about 4,000 years. Now it is being used with an accuracy supposed back to 25,000 years. And to read to you about this method of dating, it is based upon some presuppositions that have not been proved as yet. Carbon-14 dating assumes that the amount of carbon-14 in the air has remained constant throughout the ages. The theory is, without going into detail, that this carbon-14 in the air, through things and other means, we take it into us, and when we die, then that's given off, and by how much is still there, they can tell how long ago you died. And it is useful. And there is some accuracy to it, though there have been some things where they have simply missed it. But Professor James R. Arnold of the University of Chicago has pointed out, and again, now we're quoting an evolutionist, so far there is no proof, independent of the method, that cosmic ray intensity has remained constant, and however reasonable it may be, we must rank this as pure supposition that you can depend upon carbon-14. If this amount of carbon has been constant and cosmic ray intensity has remained constant, then you can rely upon it. If it hasn't, and there's no reason to believe that it has, then it is not reliable and should not be accepted without question. Then we come to thorium, lead, and potassium, argon, radiocarbon dating methods, and they are also based upon some other unproved assumptions. But let me give you this. A.O. Woodford in Historical Geography said on page 218, after all of these methods of dating that they have, what really is the one that the geologist relies on most? And he says at present, fossil correlations seem to be safer guides in most cases. And where they date a rock, but it does not correspond to where they think that rock belongs, they put that rock where they think it belongs, regardless of what method they use in dating the rock. That is the thing that has the greatest influence with them, so say the evolutionists themselves. But let me read this to you from a renowned evolutionist, and he has shaken up the evolutionary world in the last 10 to 15 years, and his name is G.A. Kerka. He's one of these who have decided that Darwin has simply missed it. He doesn't know yet how evolution works, though he still believes in evolution. And he says there is fossil evidence to help us here, though many of the key transitions are not well documented, and we have as yet to obtain a satisfactory method of dating the fossils. We have as yet to obtain a satisfactory method of dating the fossils. G.A. Kerka, and there's no one who's going to object to his credentials as a scientist and as an evolutionist. The evidence we have at present is insufficient to allow us to decide the answers to these problems. So don't get alarmed then every time somebody tells you that here is a rock that is 60 million years old and it belongs here. Those methods are not yet proved to be that trustworthy or that reliable, and they don't take them that seriously when they disagree with how old they think the rock really ought to be. As far as present-day geology is concerned, and its present state and its ability to tell us these things, which it tells us so positively and definitely, let me read to you the words of Robin S. Allen, and this is taken from the Bulletin of the Geographical Society of America. And his statement is, because of the sterility of its concepts, historical geology, which includes paleontology and stratigraphy, has become static and unproductive. Current methods of delimiting intervals of time, which are the fundamental units of historical geology, and of establishing chronology, are of dubious validity. Worse than that, the criteria of correlation, the attempt to equate in time or synchronize the geological history of one area with that of another, are logically vulnerable. The findings of historical geology are suspect because the principles on which they are based are either inadequate, in which case they should be reformulated, or false, in which case they should be discarded. Most of us refuse to discard or reformulate, and the result is the present deplorable state of our discipline. Now, I know that's been tedious and detailed, but what that says is that these dates that put the age of the earth 4 6/10 billion years and the beginning of protozoa one-cell life 2.5 billion years ago, and this outburst of life that we find in the Cambrian at 600 million years ago, and the extinction of dinosaurs at 70 million years ago, and man's existence maybe now 3 million years ago, these are anything but exact, and they do not rest upon sound principles. And really, the thing that ultimately decides these dates for the evolutionist is where he thinks they ought to go, depending upon how long he thinks it took them to develop. And I want to say this, it's something that I'll come back to later on in the lesson. When you find a fossil with fish, or when you find a fossil of fish, and you find it in a certain stratum, you are not going to find just fish there. Now, this won't assemble you may, but in the same layer of the earth, in the same stratum, you're going to find other forms of life. But because the fish may be predominant, that's called a key fossil, and so that's where they decide this ought to go. even though it may have a bird in it, they decide that it goes here and they'll worry later about how the bird might have gotten into that assemblage or into that layer of the earth's crust. Please do not be persuaded by this geological column in your textbooks. And if your teacher starts asking you all of these dates, you be sure and you know that they are certainly not positive. And there is no way to prove that they are so. Indeed, there are other means of looking at the earth which indicate that the earth is far, far younger than evolutionists would date the earth. First of all, there's the amount of salt in the sea. And given the amount of salt that is there, if salt were being put into the sea at the same rate that it is today, the sea is only 200,000 years old. Now I say only, that may sound like a long time to us, but compared to 4.6 billion years, that's a relatively short period of time. Or, most likely, we are told, 50,000 years old, the sea. And it's not likely that salt is going into the ocean at the same rate that it is now. It's not even likely that there was no salt in the sea to begin with. If God made animals to inhabit salt water, and they preferred salt water, there was likely some salt water in the beginning. There was the appearance of age, I suppose we might say. Adam and Eve, or Cain, in planting his crops, didn't have to wait for the deterioration of rocks and the decaying of limbs and trees and such to make soil. God made the earth with soil ready to begin and ready to live upon. There was likely salt in the sea, but if it weren't, there would have been more salt on the continents than now, because so much of it is washed in, and it would have gone into the ocean at a far faster rate. It is wholly conceivable, given the measure of salt in the oceans then, to arrive at a much younger date than 50,000 years for the age of the earth. Or I remember in 1968 when cores were taken up from the bottom of the ocean to see what we could find out about our earth. And if the earth is 4.6 billion years old, the sediment from microscopic organisms in the sea dying, and from dust blowing into the ocean, the sediment should have formed a layer 12 miles deep in the ocean. In the center of the ocean, there's hardly any at all, and only a half-mile layer around the edges, which indicates that the earth is far, far younger than has been supposed by this geological column. Or this fact: there's 1,000 tons of meteoric dust from meteors that fall on the earth every day. And if the world has been here 4.6 billion years, there should be a layer of meteoric dust out there 54 feet deep. And if one says, well, it's just probably mixed with the rest of the earth's crust. This that comes from meteors is rich in nickel, and there's just not that much nickel out there. Another evidence that the earth is far younger than the evolutionists had supposed. Now, while I may have been talking about some things that have the word "you," there are things that our youngsters are running into in school, and they're being challenged with. And I hope you youngsters see that there are some answers to those things, but I want us to take a look at the fossil record and see what we find there. And I want to read a statement that I read to you the other evening from Charles Darwin. Darwin looked at the geological record. He looked at the fossils. And here's what he said. And this is in his chapter in Origin of Species on difficulties of the theory. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? And his idea is, first of all, if you just look at nature, why don't we find links in between apes and men, alligators and birds? Why isn't all nature in confusion? And that puzzled him. And you could explain that away. He had difficulty explaining why that wasn't found in the fossil record. Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record. He goes ahead to say, we cannot prove that a single species is changed. Now, we talked about species the other night, and it's an imprecise term. and use some other if you please. But what that just says is we can't prove from the rocks and what we find in the rocks that any one kind of life has changed into another kind of life. He says there's absolutely no evidence of it in the fossil record. That ought to startle any evolutionist. It did indeed startle Darwin, and he didn't know the answer to it. He thought it was the imperfection of the geological record. We have evolutionists today who are now saying that Darwin's been wrong all along anyhow, and they're saying that in itself is an inadequate explanation. We have enough fossils that if those intermediate links were there, we ought to be able to see them. And that's why Professor Goldschmidt at the University of California has said, and I remind you of this again, in a new concept of evolution, that the forms are not there. Never existed that one day an alligator laid an egg and it hatched a bird. That's a new explanation for evolution. Why? Because they can't find anything between the alligators and the birds, or they can't find anything between man and apes, and between apes and quadruped mammals, and reptiles and mammals and birds, and amphibians and reptiles, and fish and amphibians, or fish and chordates, or metazoa and chordates, or protozoa and metazoa, or in between all the different kinds of reptiles, or all the different kinds of amphibians, or all the different kinds of fish, or all the different kinds of apes. They can't find any of those links. They're not there. They're not in the fossil record. That's why it's been being said for a number of years now that the fossil record does not belong to the evolutionist. What he needs to find, what he has been looking for, simply is not there. And then this statement again that I gave you from Geology Today, which says the fossil record has no evidence of parent-daughter relationships. That's as recent as 1973. In that explanation, the reptiles would be the parent, the birds the daughters, because the reptiles developed into birds. And that statement again from Geology Today, the fossil record has no evidence of parent-daughter relationships. And let me remind you, when somebody talks about the missing link, they are extremely uninformed. There are millions of missing links. They've never found one single missing link in between any of the life forms as we know the life forms to be now, or as we have seen them in the rocks. None of them are there. No missing links. And so don't let anybody pompously tell you that you should not reject evolution just because you haven't found the missing link. This whole thing is full of missing links, and there are these admissions. Those who are intent upon believing evolution are having to change the whole theory and get rid of Darwin. But that was pointed out in connection with some of these things going on in the news media. I suppose the trial down in Little Rock, Arkansas. And they interviewed a scientist here in New York, I believe. And he said, oh, these creationists are saying that we don't have any missing links. He says, what about the horse series? There is a case where we have the intermediate forms. Well, if you had it in the horse series, that leaves several million others where they don't have it. But I don't believe they have it in the horse series either. There's little Eohippus. Those of you in school who've seen this portrayed in your textbooks have seen this little bitty four-legged creature about the size of a dog. And you've seen other forms that look roughly like a horse, and then you've seen today's modern horse. Well, one thing they have done with that is that they've taken the smallest little Eohippus they ever found, rather than the largest, which is the size of a Shetland pony, just to make the difference look greater. Furthermore, according to his bone structure, there were some organs that were in Eohippus which showed him to be more sophisticated than our present horse. And our present horse lost a few teeth along the way, and rather than the strong arched back, he's got a weaker sway back. That doesn't sound like evolution and progressing to a higher form of animal. That sounds like degradation. And yet our horse is supposed to have evolved and become a superior animal to little Eohippus, who is extinct. What happened to him? Well, it became extinct. Lots of things become extinct. Dinosaurs have become extinct. The buffalo would have been extinct in the last century if our government hadn't stepped in. So there was a little form of animal one time named Eohippus. He could have been another variety of horse. He may well be just an entirely different kind of animal that lived and is extinct. And some of the other fossils we see could well be varieties of horses. But here is Dr. G.A. Kercutt again. And he says this: At present, however, it is a matter of faith. Did you hear what he said? That's what I've been saying all along about this whole thing. He says it is a matter of faith that the textbook pictures are true. I don't know if any of you youngsters, I'd be curious, how many of you youngsters here this evening in your library books or textbooks have seen the horses lined up in the little hippos? Will you raise your hand, see if I'm dealing with something? Okay, here's one, here's another one. There's several back there who've seen that. Now here's what this evolutionist says. At present, however, it is a matter of faith that the textbook pictures are true, or even that they are the best representations of truth that are available to us. And so it peeves me a little bit when I hear some pompous evolutionists talk about the series, the horse series, as evidence of evolution and as a place where the gaps are filled in. Even you take what they've got represented, you've still got a lot of gaps to fill in, immeasurable gaps to fill in. Well, I want to emphasize what is missing in all of this by showing you one of these gaps in these words. Between the Cambrian, right here, between the Cambrian when it probably originated and the Ordovician, right here. I'm going to start back and get my glasses and focus again. Between the Cambrian when it probably originated and the Ordovician when the first fossils of animals with really fish-like characteristics appeared, there is a gap of perhaps 100 million years, which we will probably never be able to fail. Now, my friend, that's quite a gap. 100 million years where they don't have something to show how these forms of life turned into the fish. The chordates became fish. 100 million years of evolutionary history missing that they never expect to find. Why is that? Well, I think the obvious answer is because that 100 million years never did exist and the fish didn't come from those in the first place. But that's just in that one instance, and you can go through that whole column with all of those years missing because they just are not the fossils, they are not the life forms that need to be in between all of these different things to produce the next kind of life. All of the gaps, they're not there. We've seen modern evolutionists admit it. We saw Darwin also admit it at the same time. I want to read to you just about mammals, for instance, about some of the things that are missing. And I'll keep this relatively short and not read too many of them. But let's take, for instance, the marsupials, or pouched animals. It says their origin is extremely ancient and its sources are not known. They haven't found what animal turned into that. The rodents, the question of their origin must be left open. The elephants, both those in Africa and those in Asia, the origins of both are obscure. They can't find the links from the elephants to lower forms. The sea cows, their origin is still a mystery to men of science. Seals, sea lions, walruses, the progenitors of the pinnipeds are completely unknown. And then the even-toed hoofed animals, their origin is uncertain. The primates, it is clear that the earliest primates are not yet known. Monkeys of the Western Hemisphere, the phylogenetic history of the New World monkeys and the platyrrhines is quite unknown. The gibbon or whatever that animal is, its origin has not yet been traced. Man, there is still no general agreement as to where true Homo sapiens, the men of our own species, developed. Each authority has his own theory for which he will fight like a mother for a child. And that's what I run into when I talk to evolutionists about their theory also. And finally, after going through a whole list, everything. This is from Earl L. Core, chairman of the Department of Biology of West Virginia University, in the textbook General Biology, 4th edition, page 299. We do not actually know the phylogenetic history of any group of plants and animals since it lies in the undecipherable past. We can't tell what came from what. We don't have a record of it. We don't know. It's not in, as we have seen time and time again this evening, the fossil record. And yet you're asked to believe it. You're asked to have faith in all the missing gaps. And what was it that George Gaylord Simpson said earlier? That which cannot be checked by observation is not science. They have faith in the gaps, and that cannot be checked by observation. Then, a most interesting thing, and this has just come to my awareness as I prepared for this series. I said I had to update several things. I knew that interesting things were going on in evolution, and evolution is in turmoil. There's a great battle going on among them. But what we have had to contend with, and what we have been represented as being so stupid about, is that we have believed in catastrophes like the flood. And we have not recognized the principle that the present is the key to the past, and that everything has gone on in a uniformitarian manner. Well, here is what one evolutionary scientist says. Since 1859, one of the most vexing properties of the fossil record has been its obvious imperfection. The inability of the fossil record to produce the missing links has been taken as solid evidence for disbelieving the theory. And he's not talking about us disbelieving the theory. He's talking about scientists disbelieving the theory. And this from Jay Gould up here in Harvard. He's one of this Harvard mafia as far as the theory of evolution is concerned. Well, he's an evolutionist, but Darwin is out. And all the slow progress that supposedly it was to take to bring this kind of animal into that's out. He says, in fact, the catastrophists were much more empirically minded than Lyell. They were much more accurate in looking at the physical evidence than Lyell. The geological record does seem to require catastrophism. That was a shock to me to read that from the words of an evolutionist. The geological record does seem to require catastrophism. Rocks are fractured and contorted, whole faunas are wiped out, and on it goes. And he furthermore says, well, I'll continue reading. The geological record, he argues, is extremely imperfect, and we must interpolate into it what we can reasonably infer but cannot see. The catastrophists were the hard-nosed empiricists of their day. Now that's what we believed in, because that's what the Bible has conveyed to us. And he said the people who held to that position are the ones who were the empiricists. They were the ones who honestly looked at the physical evidence, not the evolutionists when he lined it up like this. And in this statement, the point emerges that if we examine the fossil record in detail, whether at the level of order or species, we find over and over again not gradual evolution, but the sudden explosion of one group at the expense of another. He said when you look at the fossil record, you do not find gradual evolution. We've been saying that for years and years and years. And we have been considered, well, not very bright for saying that. And here's one of Harvard's controversial, but certainly reputable scientists saying what we have said the Bible says all along. Now, he doesn't believe the Bible. He's not going to believe the Bible. He's a humanist. But at least he's showing some of the fallacies of the theory of evolution that we've had to tolerate all this period of time. Evolution's problems, well, they're the missing fossils we've talked about. Then there are the misplaced fossils, the fossils that show up where the evolutionist doesn't think they ought to be. They're the footprints of men in the Carboniferous period, 250 million years ago. I'll have that on there. He said a breakdown of one of these others here. But anyhow, 250 million years ago, we can find. Now, I want you to understand, I'm using these years accommodatively. This is the way they've got them lined up, and we've been sufficiently critical, I take it, of this whole thing. But where they find rocks that they would say, oh yeah, that goes right here. 250 million years ago, they found also something that has amazed them. Human footprints in Virginia, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Illinois, and Missouri. And here's what one geologist says about that. If man, or even his ape ancestor, or even the ape ancestor's early mammalian ancestor, existed as far back as in the Carboniferous period in any shape, then the whole science of geology is so completely wrong that all the geologists will resign their jobs and take up truck driving. Shall we vote? Hence, for the present at least, science rejects the attractive explanation that man made these mysterious prints in the mud of the Carboniferous period with his feet. But those footprints are there. There's no reason to deny them, but they are denied. There are footprints also back here in this Cretaceous period with the dinosaurs in the Paluxy River Valley in Texas. And I've seen geologists question about those human footprints. I mean, 5 toes, angular, a big toe, down to a little toe, ball of a foot, and an arch. And some of them didn't have the whole foot. You just saw the toes clawing into the mud, and the footprints were very far apart. And over here, dinosaur footprints. And I know what that guy was doing. He was running. That's why you just see that kind of footprint. But there are some footprint there. We did that last night. There's some footprints there that are of average size. There are some footprints there that are up to 16 inches long. But be that as it may, they appear to be human footprints. And I saw one geologist, and he was asked, are these human footprints? He said, well, probably they're rather clever carvings. I don't know why it didn't appear to him that the dinosaur footprints might be clever carvings. He accepted those. But this was in the bed of the river that they dammed up and looked in, so they just dug away in the same strata, dug away the bank, and there they found further footprints showing no, they were not clever carvings. They'd been there all along. Man lived at the same time as dinosaurs, or dinosaurs lived at the same time that man did. But he rejects that. Another one was asked, are these human footprints? And he said, no. And they said, how do you know? And he said, because man didn't live then. Honestly. And that's the kind of answers I've seen time and time again. I mean, I'm not being critical scientists. I'm not saying that scientists are dumb bunnies. We've got some brilliant people, obviously, in this world today. But it all can. When I have read some of the things they have written, especially controversial about the theory of evolution, and scientists don't like it when somebody who's not a scientist says this, but they really do lack objectivity. But I'm not the only one who says that. There are other scientists that say that also when they are examining the theory of evolution. Well, some other things that they cannot explain about misplaced fossils. How old do they think the coal beds are? Incredibly old, and yet there was a fossilized human skull found in England in 1842 in a coal bed, but that was overlooked. There are other fossils of human beings, substantially as we are today, found way down here, but you never hear of them. Why? Because man didn't live down here. And it's just ignored and overlooked. Now, if they can find something up in here, they try to do a lot with it. And they'll take something that was pretty much ape-like, and they'll put all sorts of features on it to make it look just a little bit human, and try to make a missing link out. But you find it down here, but he is there. There's evidence that he's there. He has been found there, and they don't know how he got there, but they just say he doesn't belong there. So you don't read about him in your textbooks, but he's there. A good source for that is to get the book Fossil Men. I think it was first put out in France. It's been translated into English. I haven't checked the library here to see if it's here, but it was in the library in Decatur, Alabama. And it's a good source for reading and finding stuff. It's an evolutionary source, but it deals with a lot of things you don't find in your high school and your college textbooks on the theory of evolution. Well, let me see what else we need to take here before we kind of close things out. Yes, this statement from Fossil Man about men when they found in here in the Mississippian and the Permian and the Jurassic, and ask why they aren't accepted. And the statement of this book, Fossil Men, is, if I can find it, we must be prepared to doubt when necessary. And the idea was, it doesn't fit our theory, so we just have to doubt that man belongs there, even though that's where we found man. And then this. And now it's going to come to a conclusion. Puzzling to the evolutionist is why, when it comes to this level. Now remember, things are not lined up like this. But when he finds rocks that have the forms of life that he would put here, he finds complex forms of life already in existence in abundance. That's not what you should find if evolution were so. You should find the metazoa, finally the little few-celled animals of about 800 cells, and there's nothing between the 1 cell and the 800 cell life forms. And then you'll find a few more higher forms, a few more higher forms, and a few more higher forms. But what you do is you just find a sudden outburst of life. If the Bible were so, what would you expect to find in the earliest stratum or strata of the earth's crust? Remember how the oceans teemed with life in Genesis, the first chapter? That's the kind of life you find where they put this rock when they find it. They put it right there and it's teeming with life, and with the same kind of life Genesis said would be there. Well, let's do this then in closing. If evolution were so, what would you expect? Well, you would expect back here in the Proterozoic era to find a few protozoa or microscopic evidences that they had been. And then you would find some of the very lower life forms of sea life. And then finally you would find a few vertebrates beginning here, the still predominant sea life, and then a few fish beginning here. And on up here you would find some amphibians, and you come on up to here and find some dinosaurs, and up to here you find birds, and up to here you find mammals, and just increasing in complexity all the time. And in nice order, uniformitarianism is so, that's what you would expect to find. What do you find? You find some instances where you'll find a segment that seems pretty much intact. Sometimes you'll find this one right here, up here on the very top. And you'll find this one right down here on the very bottom. There is a 20,000 square mile area in southern Alberta where you find this, the whole thing, just upside down. That's what you find. Well, how does that fit in with the Bible? Well, if the Bible were so, you would expect to find not just a few life forms here, you would expect to find a sudden outburst of life, preceded by no life, and all of a sudden a sudden outburst. And you know what? That's what you find. And you would expect if a flood came along that burst open the fountains of the great deep, bring about the explosions in the earth's crust that would bring about, and all of the heavens being opened and the water pouring down upon the earth and a great amount of erosion that would take place there, you would expect to find the shelled animals, because of their lack of mobility, buried on the bottom. You would expect in general to find the higher life forms up here buried in higher strata. But because of the turmoil that is going on, you would expect to find sometimes the whole thing just mixed up and maybe even upside down. Now that's what you find, my friend, when you start digging in the fossil record. You find it sometimes upside down, you find it somewhere or another intact, and you find it sometimes all mixed up. That's not what the evolutionary model calls for, but for one who believes the Bible, that's what you find. Well, let's close this evening. It's been kind of like the first lesson, a little bit more tedious. It wasn't as easy flowing as last evening's lesson. Tomorrow evening's lesson ought to be more easy flowing. We're going to take a look at another romantic presentation of evolution in looking at the ape men, the cavemen, and prehistoric men, and say, what about them? And I think you're going to be surprised when we take a look at some of that evidence. Tonight, remember that fossils are not found in this order so as to prove evolution. They find this fossil and they think it belongs there, so they put it there. They find this fossil and they think it belongs there, so they put it there. Then they line it up and they say, look, that proves evolution, and they're arguing in a circle, like the fellow who got his little fish. He says, look, Eureka, I found my 500 million year old fish. How do you know it's 500 years old? Because it's in that 500 million year old rock. How do you know that rock's 500 million years old? Because it had this 500 million year old fish in it. And you heard me read scientists admitting that then he'd argue like that. They stated in little fancier words than Theophilus did in that little cartoon. And you don't have to rely upon the dates that are given for the age of the earth from all of this, the other things that suggest far younger earth. And these are arranged with the presumption of evolution. And then, of course, there are the gaps in all of them. There are no intermediate life forms such as one would expect to find if he's going to believe in the theory of evolution. We call upon you to believe God. There are plenty of reasons to believe his word. Put your faith in him. And if you believe in God, you see that man is a creature who has sinned and needs saving, and you see God as a God of love and he wants to save you. And he bids you to come to him through Jesus Christ. He requires you to believe in Christ, repent of your sins, and be baptized for the remission of them. If you're here tonight and not a Christian, not a disciple of Christ, we invite you to come all together and stand and sing. Oh, how long it took it to form, and I remember how long I was taught in school. Well, I don't remember exactly how long, but I remember it was a long time. But now, there are other ideas about that. American cold geologist A.S. Moore says that coal can form in a very short time given the right circumstances. And what it needs is sufficient material, it needs pressure, and it needs heat. And in the flood, for instance, perhaps is the origin of it, when whole populations of vegetative material would be washed together and buried under pressure, and all the movement taking place, creating friction, or maybe just pressing it further toward the Earth's center to give you heat, you have the right combinations to produce coal, and he said a very short period of time. Now, I don't know how long that is, but a very short period of time is not 500 million years. And as far as oil is concerned, well, if it is fossil fuel, and it most likely is, of course, there's always the idea that God could have made a mature Earth, could have, did in some respects, I'm persuaded. How were Adam and Eve one day after they were made? They were old enough to have children, be given the command to go and replenish the earth. But they were only 1 day old, but they were apparently about 47. That's how you got to be before you're mature. Or whatever age you want to pick. Apparently they were that old, but really they were 1 day old. But remember the Arab oil embargo in 1967 and the Michigan State professor who made the news because he took his garbage, and from his garbage he made fuel for his motorcycle. It doesn't take so much time if you've got the right circumstances, if you've got heat and if you've got pressure. And I've seen demonstrations in the Chicago Field Museum of Natural History that showed how oil was made, and this animal died, and the substance from him just oozed way down there. And this animal died, and the substance from him oozed way down there. First of all, that just put it under pressure. And that's going to take probably only 26 billion years up here, or 600 million years since living forms came into existence to give us the amount of oil that we've got. But if you took whole great populations of an immensely covered earth, rich in life, and have them all destroyed and buried in great deposits, and buried deep under pressure with friction, or buried deep in just the heat of being closer to the center of the earth, you have that which could produce oil. Oil from the Gulf of Mexico, and however they did it, in one instance was dated at 10,000 years. It didn't take all that long to form. I don't know if the flood answers all the problems of geology. I doubt it does. I think it answers some. So, don't be too hasty to think you have to believe in the theory of evolution. When people start talking about coal and oil, there are the explanations, and they're coming to the fore at this present time. Do you have any questions? We want you to have the opportunity to ask them, so we're going to close the service in a moment, and you come on down front, and if there are any who want to ask questions, if there are others who want to sit in on the question and answer session, you can come on too. But those of you who would like to leave and go and take the children home, you'll be free to do that, and you'll have to stay for that period. But if you have questions, feel free to come on down. Tomorrow night we're going to look at ape men, cavemen, prehistoric men, and such.